The first shot cracked the night wide open before we'd even cleared the tree line, and I already knew this run was going to end one of two ways. Either I lost the woman I'd spent 6 weeks falling for, or I finally brought down the man I'd spent a year chasing, and there wasn't going to be a middle version of that night. Kansas, 1886. My name's Tobias Kane, and I'd come to Cedar County a year into building a federal case against a whiskey supplier named Ezra Munroe, the kind of man who'd turned quiet desperation into a business model across 3 counties. Rosalind Calloway ran product for him out of her own root cellar, and the first time I saw her, auburn hair pulled back in a braid that couldn't quite contain it, sharp hazel eyes that took my measure before I'd even said a word, a face striking enough that I lost my prepared opening sentence entirely standing there in her doorway. I understood immediately that this case had just become considerably more complicated than I'd planned for. She'd been running whiskey 3 months by then, out of that root cellar, to keep the bank from taking the 160 acres her late husband Daniel had died proving up under the Homestead Act. 160 acres that represented 5 years of continuous residence, a modest frame house, a proved-up well, and every single thing either of them had ever worked for since the day they married. A cowhand's wage ran $25 a month if he was lucky. Her whiskey runs paid triple that in a single night, which was exactly the kind of money that got a widow noticed by the wrong people, in a business built entirely on nobody noticing anything at all. Daniel had died 8 months before I ever knocked on her cellar door, not from any single dramatic accident, but from the slow, grinding kind of failure that homestead land sometimes hands a man. A fever caught working fields through a wet spring because they couldn't afford to let even one planting season go. She'd told me the whole of it much later than she should have needed to, sitting in the wreckage of a wagon with glass cuts across both our hands, and I understood by then exactly why a woman that capable, that fiercely, strikingly beautiful, even exhausted and afraid, had turned to whiskey running rather than simply losing everything her husband bled for. Ezra Munroe, I'd learned across a full year of careful investigation, wasn't simply a supplier looking the other way while desperate farmers moved his product. He'd built a network across 3 counties over 5 years, cutting his liquor with whatever kept costs down, running girls through a supposedly respectable boarding house outside town, and quietly buying up the debts of struggling farmers so that when the bank came calling, as it inevitably did, he was there waiting with an offer that looked like salvation and worked like a noose. Doc Hensley in town charged $2 a visit for anyone sick. Money families like the Calloways rarely had to spare, and Munroe understood that particular arithmetic of desperation better than any man in the county. Rosalind was one of perhaps a dozen farmers running product for him that year, and understanding the full scope of what she'd walked into, without ever meaning to, was most of why I'd spent 6 weeks buying from her with careful money and careful questions, rather than simply arresting her the first week and calling my case closed early. I want to say plain before this story goes any further, what kind of trouble I'd let myself walk into. It wasn't simply that I was building a federal case in a dangerous county. It was that somewhere around the 4th week of buying whiskey from a widow with sharp, unforgettable hazel eyes and a jaw that never once softened for anyone, I'd stopped thinking of her purely as a case detail and started thinking about a future that had absolutely no business including a federal agent falling for the very evidence he was supposed to be protecting his distance from. There'd been a night, just 4 days before the ambush, when I'd lingered past the usual business of loading barrels, standing in her kitchen doorway with my hat in my hands, the particular way a man holds a hat when he's deciding whether to say something he can't take back. Mrs. Calloway, I'd started, and she'd waited, something careful and tight crossing her striking features, and I'd gotten as far as, "I find myself thinking about you in ways that aren't," before a wagon wheel had cracked loudly in the yard outside, one of my own horses spooked by something in the dark, and the moment had scattered into practical concerns about the animal and the wheel, and I hadn't found my way back to that unfinished sentence in the 4 days since. Before I go on, I want to step outside the story for just a moment. If you're driving right now, or in the kitchen with this playing low, or just sitting somewhere quiet tonight, thank you for spending part of your evening with Rosalind and me. If a story like this one has found any kind of place in you, I'd be grateful if you'd leave it a like and hit subscribe before you go on your way. It costs you nothing, and it means quite a lot to a channel still finding its footing. Now, back to that creek crossing, because the shooting is only just beginning, and there's a good deal more truth still waiting to come out before this night is through. Munroe's riders hit us at the creek crossing, muzzle flash lighting the dark in short, violent bursts, water exploding up around the wagon wheels as we splashed through. I counted 4 riders in that first confused second, maybe 5, torches unlit but moonlight enough to catch the shine of drawn revolvers, Munroe's own heavy-set silhouette unmistakable at the center of them even in the chaos. A man who'd built a smuggling operation over half a decade and had no intention of watching a federal agent take it apart over one bad night. I hauled the wagon hard left, barrels of whiskey sliding and cracking behind us, splinters and spilled liquor mixing with the creek spray, and shouted the only thing that mattered. They know, ride. Rosalind didn't ask questions. She put the whip to the team and didn't look back until the creek was well behind us and the shooting had thinned to nothing but our own hammering hearts and the ragged sound of both our breathing, the horse's flanks heaving beneath a coat of sweat and fear lather that wouldn't fully settle for another hour of hard riding. "Federal agent," she said, once she could breathe again, the words coming out flatter than she probably intended, more accusation than question. "You let me hand you evidence for 6 weeks. You sat in my kitchen. You knew exactly what you were doing every single time." "I did," I said, no attempt to soften it. "I also didn't plan on any of the rest of it." "The rest of what?" "I let myself fall for a woman running whiskey to save her land," I said, meeting her eyes steady even with the wagon still rattling beneath us, close enough now to see every fierce, striking line of her face clearly in the moonlight. "Wasn't planning on either one, the case or you. Only one of them I'm sorry for." She didn't answer that right away. There wasn't a safe answer sitting anywhere close to hand, and we both knew it. We lost Munroe's riders in the breaks by the river, the wagon wheel finally giving out on a deep rut, cracking with a sound like a gunshot itself that made us both flinch before we understood what it was. We climbed down into the cold dark, both of us bleeding from glass and splinters where the barrels had shattered, and sat together against the wagon's canted frame not saying much, because there wasn't much left that needed saying out loud after everything the night had already said for us. I tore a strip from my own shirt sleeve without a word and wrapped a shallow cut across the back of her hand, my fingers steadier than I actually felt, the small practical gesture somehow more disarming than anything I'd said back at the creek. "You could arrest me," she said eventually, watching me work. "Right now, nobody would ever know you didn't." "I could," I agreed, not looking up from the makeshift bandage. "But you won't." I was quiet a long moment, turning something over in my own mind the way I'd been turning over that unfinished sentence for 4 days. "I've been building this case for a year," I said. "Munroe's the one poisoning half the county with cut whiskey and worse, running girls through here he's got no business running, and every farmer he's squeezed into working for him because the bank came for their land first, same as it came for yours. You're not the case, Rosalind. You're barely a footnote in it. I can write the evidence up without your name anywhere in the filing, and I intend to." "Why?" "Because arresting a widow for surviving isn't justice," I said. "It's just paperwork wearing justice's coat. And because I meant what I said back at the creek, badly timed as it was." She told me then about Daniel, about the fever and the fields and the funeral on a Tuesday, about 8 months of solitary arithmetic trying to keep 160 acres from becoming somebody else's inheritance. She hadn't told the whole of it to another living soul, not even Martha at the Mercantile, and something in me ached listening to a woman that capable, that fiercely striking even bloodied and exhausted, describe carrying all of it entirely alone. "I know something about grief making a person reckless," I said, when she'd finished. 2 years back, working a case in Missouri, I got close to a source the way I shouldn't have. Not romantically, just too close, too trusting, too eager to believe the good in someone I needed to believe was good. Her name was Etta. She fed me information on a counterfeiting ring running out of her own husband's print shop, and I promised her protection I didn't have the authority to actually guarantee. She died because of information I should have protected better and didn't, 6 weeks before the case even closed, and I've carried that particular arithmetic ever since. How close is too close? How much protection is enough? When does caring about someone become the exact thing that gets them killed? I've been careful ever since. Careful the way you get when you've already paid once for not being careful enough. "And tonight you weren't careful," she said. "Tonight I decided careful had already cost me more than it saved," I said. Watching Munroe's men close in on that creek crossing, the only thing running through my head wasn't the case, it was you. And now, Now I'm sitting in a wrecked wagon with a woman I've been falling for since roughly the second week, telling her the truth I should have told her the first, I said. Careful only gets a man so far before it just becomes its own kind of cowardice. We made it back to her farm before dawn on foot, leading the lamed horses through the last 2 miles of frost-hardened road, our breath showing white in the cold, neither of us saying much beyond the practical business of the walk itself, the eastern sky just beginning to grey by the time the farmhouse came into view, looking exactly as it always had, entirely unaware of what the night had cost and settled between us. I remember thinking, watching that familiar roofline emerge out of the pre-dawn dark, that I'd spent a year of careful investigative distance and lost every bit of it to a widow with a ledger and a stubborn refusal to be anyone's easy case. Munroe's gang scattered inside a month once my case came down through federal court, built carefully enough that Rosalind's name never surfaced anywhere in the filing, exactly as I'd promised. Munroe himself took a plea rather than risk trial, the water rights and protection racket he'd built over years unraveling in the space of a few court dates, the counterfeit and cut liquor operation alone earning him 8 years at the territorial prison once the full accounting came out. 3 other farmers who'd been running product for him, same as Rosalind, had came forward once word spread the federal case wasn't interested in prosecuting desperate widows and struggling homesteaders, only the man who'd engineered their desperation in the first place, and Cedar County's whiskey trade quieted considerably in the months that followed. Her banknote got paid a different way after that, my federal salary, quietly, for a while, until I pointed out plainly one evening at her kitchen table that partners don't keep separate ledgers, and she stopped arguing the point somewhere around the 3rd time I made it. She'd worn Daniel's wedding ring on a chain around her neck those 8 months, not on her hand, not able yet to take it fully off, but not able either to keep wearing it the way a living wife wears her husband's ring. Some jewelry a person carries because setting it down feels like a second kind of loss, smaller than the first but real all the same, and I understood that better than I let on, having carried my own version of Etta's memory the same careful way for 2 years running. The morning I finally asked her properly, kneeling in the same kitchen where I'd once lost my nerve mid-sentence, she took that chain off for the first time in 8 months and set it carefully in the small wooden box where she kept Daniel's other few belongings, not because she'd stopped grieving him, she told me later, but because she'd finally understood grief and moving forward weren't actually opposites. We were married that spring on the same 160 acres Daniel had died for, a small ceremony, mostly neighbors, a circuit preacher charging his usual 50 cents and asking no questions about a widow marrying a federal agent inside a single year. She wore a new ring after that, on the proper hand, and some mornings watching her draw water or work the fields, striking and capable and entirely hers to love now, I understood I'd stopped simply admiring her the way a stranger admires a beautiful, formidable woman from a careful distance, and started loving her the way a man loves the person he's chosen to build the rest of his life beside. The whiskey running stopped the same month the case closed. She sold the root cellar's remaining stock to a legitimate distillery in Topeka instead, at a fraction of what the illegal trade had paid, but without the particular weight of looking over her shoulder every single night, which turned out to be worth considerably more than the difference in price. Some nights I still hear that first shot crack the dark open, the one that started the whole desperate run toward the creek crossing, and I think about how the worst night of both our lives turned out to be the one that saved everything. Not because the danger itself was any kind of gift, but because it stripped away 6 weeks of careful, unfinished sentences between 2 people who'd both been too frightened of their own grief to say plainly what they meant. Sometimes it takes gunfire to say what a kitchen doorway couldn't. Thank you for riding along tonight. Until the next story finds you.